In our last installment of the Acts series, we covered the Apostle Paul's arrival in Jerusalem with Luke and the men who assisted in bringing the special offering from the Gentile believers in the regions of Macedonia and Achaia and Asia, as well as the events that shortly followed there in Jerusalem. We saw last time, a few days before Paul's week of purification came to an end, some unbelieving Jews from Ephesus came and accused him of disparaging the Jews and Judaism in all of the areas through which he had traveled. They also accused him that he had taught Jews that they no longer needed to practice circumcision or to keep the rituals associated with the animal sacrifices. And then they went on to lie about Paul bringing a Gentile into the holy courts of the temple complex. In the riot, of course, that followed, we saw Paul was saved by Roman soldiers, after which he was allowed by the tribune, the commander of the Roman forces, to defend himself by addressing all of those in the crowd, the mob there that had assembled. We concluded last time down here in verses 19, 20, when Paul was coming to the close of his defense. He had related up to this point in his defense that Jesus had come to him in a vision while he was praying at the temple in Jerusalem and warned him to leave because his life was in danger. Paul, we saw last time, responded by telling Jesus that surely all of these people who knew him realized, how vociferous he was against the way, against these followers of Jesus. Certainly they would accept his witness since he had been such a staunch enemy of Jesus Christ and had made a complete about-face from his hostility. Such a dramatic change in Paul, he told Jesus, that should surely convince them that indeed you have risen from the dead. They'll listen to me. That was what Paul thought. Verse 21, chapter 22 of Acts, we continue. Then he, Jesus, said to me, that is in response to what Paul had said, well, they'll listen to me, surely they'll listen to me. Depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. Jesus insisted that Paul's role would, from that day forward, be to witness primarily to those peoples who had not descended from Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. Verse 22, complete Jewish Bible. They had been listening. That is, the crowd that was assembled there, that had already tried to kill him, to beat him up. They had been listening to him up to this point. But now they shouted at the top of their lungs, as soon as he said, to the Gentiles. They shouted at the top of their lungs, rid the earth of such a man, he's not fit to live. The Jewish crowd was aware, without question. They were aware that God had promised the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that all of the nations of the earth would be blessed through their offspring. And so they were very well aware of those promises. They knew that all the nations could be blessed. However, they had been taught by their priests and rabbis that the Gentiles could only achieve that blessing that was mentioned to the patriarchs by converting first to Judaism. That's the only way they could get that blessing. They had to convert to Judaism. They were outraged over the idea that the Gentiles could be offered that blessing without first undergoing conversion to Judaism. Such a concept in the minds of the Jews would make Gentiles equal to them. The Gentiles equal to us in the sight of God? That was untenable. That was even blasphemous to the Jews. Hence the reason they said, this man's not fit to live. Kill him. How can he say those things? Verse 23, going on in the complete Jewish Bible, they were screaming, waving their clothes, and throwing dust into the air. they demonstrated their rage and desire to kill Paul by these actions. Since stones were not available along the streets in that part of Jerusalem, they resorted to reaching down and getting hands full of dirt and throwing the dirt at Paul to show them that they wanted him dead. Had they had stones, they would have stoned him right then and there. Verse 24, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, back up to the fortress, and said that he should be examined under scourging, or the New Living Translation has, ordered him lashed with whips to make him confess his crime. That's what examining under scourging is. So that he, the commander, might know why they, the crowd, the Jews there, shouted so against him. Now the tribune either could not understand Aramaic to know what Paul was saying, what he was, telling the crowd, or he could not make sense. He may have been able to understand Aramaic. Chances are he could, because he was stationed there, and he would, of course, you'd want to know what the people are saying. And so he couldn't make any sense why the crowd suddenly erupted. They'd been listening intently, and then all of a sudden they erupted with vehemence, great hostility. And so he couldn't figure it out from what Paul had said. Why should they blow up like this? Now, since the tribune's major responsibility was to keep the peace, to enforce the Pax Romana, that was his job in Jerusalem, is to enforce the peace. And since that was his responsibility, he needed to take action that would appease the crowd. Therefore, he intended to do what any good Roman soldier would do: torture Paul until he extracted the truth. That's what you got to do. You've got to use torture. The device of torture mentions here scourging or lashed with whips, other translations say. The device of torture was the Roman scourge, which consisted of multiple leather straps, fairly long straps, that were studded. On the ends were tied bone fragments and little sharp pieces of metal, so that when that scourge came, it ripped flesh away. We've covered that, when we went through the Matthew series and what Jesus was required to undergo before crucifixion. By this point in his ministry, you will remember, up to this point in time, prior to Paul coming to Jerusalem, and he had been over in Achaia, he had been in Corinth, he had been in Ephesus, he had written both of the letters that we have in the Scriptures, in the New Testament, both 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. He had already written prior to coming. And so we go to 2 Corinthians and we find, when we read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, that Paul had already, by this point in his life, had been beaten with rods 3 times by the Romans. And he also tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 that he had received 39 lashes from Jewish authorities on 5 separate occasions. So he had already been beaten and lashed, but what the tribune had ordered here, scourging, was much more severe than any of his earlier beatings, because scourging often left some people crippled and others dead. They simply died because of the amount of blood loss as the sharp bones and metal shards would cut into the flesh and hit them in the neck or something, and they'll bleed out pretty quick. And so this was a dangerous undertaking. Going on in verse 25, New Living Translation has, when they tied Paul down to lash him, Paul said to the officer, or the centurion, as several other translations have, he said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to whip or to scourge," the New King James has, "to scourge a Roman citizen who hasn't even been tried?" Now, since he had used his Roman citizenship at earlier times, Paul knew that Roman law absolutely prohibited any kind of torture of a Roman citizen without first having formal charges presented and having a hearing before a Roman magistrate, at a Roman official. So he knew that that was the law. So when he made this question, he knew what the response was going to be. So verse 26, New King James goes on, when the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, take care what you do, for this man is a Roman, or as other translations have, he is a Roman citizen. Now, the centurion, who was under the authority of the tribune. Remember, the tribune he was kind of the general there at the fortress. The centurion was a lower officer, and so he was under the authority of the tribune. So the centurion, could not revoke the command of the tribune because he had no right to submarine what his superior officer said. So for his sake, the sake of the centurion, as well as that of the tribune, he went directly to the tribune with his knowledge. We need to be careful here because we can find ourselves in some real hot water if we continue on. Verse 27, then the commander, the tribune, came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? He, Paul, said, yes. Now, since making a false claim, people say, well, anybody could say that. No, you didn't want to say that. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you did not want to say you were a Roman citizen because making the false claim of Roman citizenship was punishable by death. Therefore, if someone spoke up, a verbal claim was sufficient. If you said you were, then, you obviously have the proof somewhere, and therefore, they're not going to proceed. The official papers that validated citizenship were generally kept in safe storage by a family. I don't know much more than that, but, as far as papers are concerned, you didn't carry those on you. Back then, there were no thumbprints, there were no photographs, that Homeland Security would approve of, that were attached to your citizenship papers. So if somebody knocked you over the head, took your papers, they could claim, this is me. So you kept your papers in a very safe place. Going on to verse 28, the commander answered, with a large sum I obtained this citizenship. And Paul said, but I was born a citizen. The tribune obviously understood the value of Roman citizenship since he had to buy his. He had to purchase it. It cost a lot of money. Since Paul was born a citizen, it's most likely that either his father or his grandfather had obtained citizenship from a very powerful Roman for either doing something for that powerful individual or doing something that was looked upon as something that was good for Rome, something that was helpful to the empire. And again, that's the only way you could get that coveted status, was to have it pronounced or to buy it. Now, all children then of a Roman citizen, every child born from that Roman citizen, and the children of those children were all Roman citizens because the citizenship passed down through the family. So people wanted to become Roman citizens so that their children could be Roman citizens and have all of the benefits of that. Verse 29, then immediately those who were about to examine him, with the scourge, withdrew from him, and the commander was, note, also afraid after he found out that he, Paul, was a Roman, and because he, the tribune, had bound him. The tribune was aware that as a Roman citizen, Paul could bring charges against him for fastening those chains on his feet and on his hands because he had bound him. And so now the tribune he should have checked this out before he went to this extent of doing what he's done. Verse 30, the next day, because he wanted to know for certain, or Goodspeed has the real reason why he, Paul, was accused by the Jews, he released him, Paul, from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. The tribune, again, was responsible for keeping the peace. He knew that to release Paul without the consent of the Jewish leadership, that could spark a major uprising, which could lead to his loss of career. He would be railroaded right out of the Roman army. He knew that. So he hoped that after tempers had had time to settle down, to cool off over the night, that some kind of understanding could be reached with the Jews, and then the tribune would be able to release Paul, the Roman citizen, because he wanted to get rid of Paul as fast as possible before all of a sudden maybe it would dawn on Paul, I can bring charges against you. So he didn't want that to happen. So he's doing what he can. He's working things to try to get this over and done with. All right, chapter 23, verse 1. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, men and brethren, or brothers, men and brethren. But no, Paul, looking earnestly, he's looking over the whole lot of them before him, and then he speaks. Now, this was not a regular meeting of the Sanhedrin. In fact, it probably wasn't even held where the Sanhedrin normally met. But rather, this was a special assembly of the council members called by the Roman tribune. Hence the reason Paul initiated the proceedings with a friendly greeting to his fellow Jews. Because in a normal Sanhedrin meeting, it would not be a person who's accused. You know, either the high priest or someone the high priest appoints would open the meeting. Paul goes on, I have lived in all good conscience, or Complete Jewish Bible has, I have lived with a perfectly clear conscience before God until this day, today, including what I did yesterday and the day before and the years before that. I've done this with a clear conscience. Now, by stating that he had done nothing against God, nothing against God's law, Paul immediately declared his innocence of all of the accusations that had been brought against him. Verse 2, and the high priest, or as Goodspeed, I think better has, by this statement, the high priest Ananias. Now, Ananias, need a little background on Ananias. This, of course, is not the Ananias that was mentioned earlier. This is different Ananias. This is high priest. Ananias gained the office of high priest through political appointment, as most of the high priests did after Rome took over that area. He probably, from what you read and ascertain from Josephus, he probably got this by bribery. And he became high priest in AD 48. There's question to whether there was a functioning high priest, but since he was the last one appointed, he was looked to as the high priest at this point. He may have still been. There's still some debate that there may have been a gap during this time where there was not an appointment. They were waiting for some reason. Ananias was a greedy, violent man who Josephus says took the tithes that came in for all of that belonged to we would say the lower priests, and he used that tithe money that he got that actually belonged to other priests in order to shower Roman officials with bribes. That's in Antiquities of the Jews, where Josephus tells us that. Even the Talmud, of all things, the Jews themselves record that Ananias was a man of extremely low character. He was absolutely hated by the majority of the Jews for his pro-Roman dealings, and he was killed eventually by the Sicarii, the assassins. We talked about them earlier in AD 66. So less than a decade later, he was put to death, and everybody was almost rejoicing at the time Ananias was killed. So, at this, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him, Paul, on the mouth. Now, Ananias was a narcissist. We all know what that is. In his exaggerated self-worth, he expected Paul to cower in his presence, to basically be on his hands and knees, begging for mercy or whatever. So when Paul boldly spoke out without groveling before Ananias. He gave the order to stop Paul from speaking. Hit him in the mouth so he'll shut up. Now, Luke does not indicate, he doesn't follow through and say whether it actually happened or not. In all likelihood, based upon Paul's response, he didn't let that happen. I don't think that he got slapped in the mouth. Paul heard exactly what he said, and he wasn't going to stand for it. So then Paul said to him, verse 3, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law. You're sitting there as a judge, an impartial judge, to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to or in violation of, other translations have, the law? Paul was well acquainted with the rights he had according to Jewish law. And the right of Jewish law has been passed down. We even have it in our nation today. Defendants are presumed innocent until proven guilty. That was the basis of their judicial law. Presumed innocent until found guilty. Ananias had absolutely no right to stop him from presenting his defense, especially by force or threat of violence. He had no right to do that, and Paul spoke up. Now, as the next verses reveal, the extent of Paul's knowledge of Ananias was that all he knew that Ananias was one of those council members who had been called, one of the members of the Sanhedrin whose actions, the actions of this man, reflected an impure, biased mind. Certainly not the mind of a righteous judge, because he wasn't willing to listen. He sat as a judge only because his impurity had been whitewashed or overlooked because of his council position. Because of the position of authority that he held, people would kowtow to him. You know, like we know certain politicians today that supposedly, they're really righteous. And so nobody calls them into question, even though they deserve probably to be in prison. All right, so whitewashed wall, that's an accurate assessment of Ananias based upon everything that the Jews thought of the guy. Verse 4, and those who stood by said, do you revile? Now, the New Revised Standard has, do you dare to insult God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. He quotes here from Exodus 22, verse 28. Because that's what it says. You don't speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, the fact was, even though God instituted the office of high priest, Ananias did not receive the office in the manner God specified. It was to be passed down in a certain way, and this hadn't been. He received his appointment as high priest from a Roman. It was a political appointment. He did not deserve to be, should never have been, obviously, with the kind of mind that he had, biased, defiled in the way it was. Despite that fact, Paul agreed that the office was to be respected, as it is indicated back in Exodus 22. He says, I did not know, brethren, that he was a high priest. From his actions, I could never have believed this could have been the high priest. There is no way I could have ever thought this guy was a high priest. That's basically the way it was. Verse 6, Goodspeed goes on. Knowing that part of them, that is part of the council members, were Sadducees, and part of them Pharisees, Paul called out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, and the son of Pharisees. It is for my hope, for the resurrection of the dead, or as the New King James has, it is for the hope and resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Realizing that Ananias had already poisoned the hope of a fair judgment that would allow him to be set free, released, Paul had no other choice at this point than to redirect the attention of the council members and thereby the whole focus of the hearing. And that's what he's doing. So instead of addressing the false accusations that had been made against him the previous day, Paul focused on the core doctrine of the followers of the way, that is, those who are part of the church, the body of Christ. The fact that the dead will be raised to life demands that there is a divine purpose for human existence. There is a purpose that God has in mind for human existence. Otherwise, there would be no resurrection. Now, the absolute proof, which is the core doctrine of the way, the absolute proof of the divine purpose of God is the resurrection of Jesus Christ to immortality. That's the proof. The absolute proof. Only those who look to Him, to Jesus Christ, and follow His example of obedience to God in their physical life can follow Him into eternal life. That's the core. We look to, without the hope of the resurrection, like Paul goes through in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, without the hope of the resurrection, what are we doing here? Verse 7, and when he, Paul, had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Now, some have concluded that the Sadducees, who were highly influenced by Greek philosophy, that some have believed that the Sadducees believed that the soul, which is self-conscious life, cannot exist apart from the body, because of what Greeks thought. You can't, the soul has to be connected to a body. And so if the body dies, then, as the Sadducees reason, if the body dies, then the soul ceases to exist. Therefore, there can't be a resurrection. The idea of a resurrection, that's impossible. Now, apparently, the Sadducees completely dismissed the teaching of the Spirit in man. Now, the reason for this is because as we've covered before, the Sadducees relied solely on the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, for their doctrine. They ignored the prophets and writings. That's 5 books of Moses. The Torah, that's all that's important. If you can't find it there, then it's not existent. Now, the Spirit in man is not mentioned in the Torah. Now, it's mentioned in Ecclesiastes, it's mentioned in a number, but it's not mentioned. It's not mentioned outside of the writings of the prophets. It's not there in the Torah. And so, therefore, they rejected it. When some of the Sadducees, let's go over here to Matthew chapter 22, when some of the Sadducees attempted to stump Jesus about, over a quarter of a century earlier with questions that seemed to make a mockery of the possibility of a resurrection, Jesus here in this section refuted those Sadducees concerning their ignorance of the truth of the resurrection that is found in the Torah, found in the law division of the Holy Scriptures, back in Exodus chapter 3. Note here, verse 29 of Matthew 22. Jesus answered and said to them, they said, okay, one brother died, his brother married his widow. That brother died, married the widow. Okay, in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be then? Say, ha, ha, ha. See what a dumb idea this resurrection is? Jesus says, you're mistaken. Not knowing the Scriptures, plural, not just the Torah, but the law and the writings. Not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God. You don't have any concept. Nothing is impossible with God, but you ignore the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, and here he quotes from Exodus 3, verse 6, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Jesus goes on, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And of course, then it goes on to show everybody was dumbfounded. They were astonished how he was able to pull this out and absolutely embarrass the Sadducees. But that was the Sadducees. And even though he had shown those Sadducees where they were in error, that didn't permeate the whole movement of the Sadducees or sect of the Sadducees. As we find out, they still believe that way over a quarter century later. Verse 9, back here in Acts 23, verse 9, then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes who were of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, note, these were of the Pharisees, saying, we find no evil in this man, but if, or Revised English Bible, but perhaps a spirit or angel has spoken to him. Let us not fight against God. Note, all of a sudden, half the people, or thereabouts, a considerable number, are now on Paul's side. We find here that the beliefs of the two groups were more important to them than deciding the guilt or the innocence of Paul. In fact, in order to jab the Sadducees a little more, note what the Pharisees purposely brought up the existence of spirits and angels, insisting that God had possibly used them to communicate with Paul, because Sadducees don't believe in spirits or angels. So, they wanted to get it, they wanted to really give it to the Sadducees here. Verse 10, and when there arose a great dissension, the commander, the tribune, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. In the commotion, the Pharisees were attempting to physically pull Paul away from the Sadducees, and the Sadducees, of course, were trying to pull Paul into their midst so they could beat him up. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to beat him and hopefully kill him right then and there. But so you got two groups, and one's pulling one arm, the other, so literally pulling him apart. Verse 11, but the following night the Lord stood by him. Now, the following night means the night that followed what happened that day. Okay, that's what it's talking, not the night after that, but that very night. Now, it says the Lord stood by him. On earlier occasions, such as in Corinth, back in chapter 18, and when Paul had to flee Jerusalem 3 years after being called, that he was relating earlier in the last chapter, which is recorded back in chapter 9. Jesus, on both of those occasions, appeared to Paul in a vision. It's clearly pointed out that both of those times were visions. Now, whether he appeared in a vision at this time or whether he physically manifested himself is not really important. However, since his appearance is here not connected with a vision, there's no mention of a vision like the other times, it probably means this was a physical manifestation. And Paul tells us back in 2 Corinthians, the fact that he had seen revelations and he had seen he had witnessed in 1 Corinthians 15, he had seen Jesus. So these were things that he had seen him, not just vision, but actually seen him appearing, just as Jesus appeared inside the room. And it should show, Thomas, reach over here. What is this? Is this not a hole or not? So I believe that's the case. Anyway, the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, or take courage, Paul, for you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. Now, Paul had earlier made plans to proceed to Rome after delivering the special offering in Jerusalem. Back in chapter 19, he made it very clear that that's what his intention was. And now, Jesus promises him that his desire would be fulfilled. He was going to go to Rome. So again, take courage. He's giving Paul some encouragement. Verse 12, and when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, or as the King James has, under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Generally, taking an oath involved proclaiming a curse on oneself if the action that was sworn was unfulfilled. If it went unfulfilled, then you proclaimed a curse. And the curse was made by calling on God to enforce. The oath called for God to enforce the curse for failure. If I don't get this done, may God do this to me. Okay. This was done by these more than 40 men in an attempt to solicit God's assistance in killing Paul and thus fulfill their hatred for Paul. Well, there are 40 of us, and if we say we're going to die, rather than let this man live, God surely will come to our side on this. Because they legitimately believed that Paul needed to be put to death because they believed that this sect of the Nazarenes, the followers of the man from Nazareth, that, this was wrong. And so, like Jesus tells us in the Olivet prophecy, or Matthew 24, they will kill you, thinking they do God's service. And that was certainly what was taking place here. They thought they were doing God's service. Verse 13. Now, there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. Now, 40 doesn't seem like much when we know that there are hundreds, maybe over 1,000 Roman soldiers up in the fortress. But in the narrow streets of Jerusalem, such a number of armed men could overwhelm a much larger group of Roman soldiers who would be escorting Paul down from the fortress. Verse 14, these men, came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great oath," or by a solemn oath, the Revised English Bible has, "that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul." These conspirators were sure that the Sadducean leadership, not the Pharisees, because we already know the Pharisees are on Paul's side, but that the Sadducean leadership of the Sanhedrin, because the high priest was a Sadducee and basically all the top positions were pretty much Sadducees. And so they were sure that the leadership of the Sanhedrin would agree to their plot to assist them in whatever way necessary, especially since they knew Ananias was really perturbed over what Paul had done the day before. Even though the terms of their vow required urgency, we'll neither eat nor drink until we've done this. That's urgent because, you can only go a few days without some liquid. And so these guys had already said, we're not going to drink anything until whenever. But even though it seemed to require urgency, if they failed in their plot, they knew that they would never starve to death or die from thirst because the rabbis, thankfully, considered 4 types of oaths or vows eligible to be annulled or rescinded. Those oaths or vows made under duress, made in error, made due to incitement by others, or due to the exaggeration of the reason for the oath. Basically, for anything. And that was what they had done. They had, okay, we're not going to hold you accountable. The priests would do the same, because they made enough oaths of their own. They wanted to get out of them. And so they had all of these reasons why, you don't worry. Go ahead and get something to eat and drink. Verse 15. Now you therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander. Now this is what the conspirators are telling the Sanhedrin chiefs here. Suggest to the commander, the tribune, that he, Paul, be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries or a more thorough investigation, the New American Standard has, concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he before he comes near. That is, before he gets here. In order to prevent the Romans from suspecting any involvement by the Sadducees, the conspirators planned to attack Paul and his escort as he was being led down from the fortress to the meeting area where the council would be assembled, which was thought to be southwest of the temple complex. So there was a stretch there. They would have to come through some narrow passages, which there are a lot of those in Jerusalem today, and I'm assuming they were that way years ago, because it's not the same passageways today that were there at this time. Verse 16. So when Paul's sister's son, or as Goodspeed has, when Paul's nephew heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks, or the fortress, and told Paul. Now, this is the first, and this is the only time any of Paul's immediate family are mentioned being directly involved with him. Never do we find it anywhere in any of his writings. Nothing there. Now, it's likely that Paul's nephew was between 20 and 30 years of age. Whether his sister resided in the area of Jerusalem is unknown. Neither are the circumstances of his nephew becoming privy to the knowledge that's revealed here by Luke. Now, it is very possible that the nephew had come to Jerusalem just as Paul had done as a young man in order to be taught by the top rabbis and maybe even some of the priests, but the rabbis were Pharisees, to be taught by them, which means that he may have been present in the area where when the conspirators came in to talk with members of the Sanhedrin. He may have been there studying at the time and overheard what was said, or he may have overheard some of the Sadducees, some of the priests discussing it quietly among themselves a little later in the day. One way or the other, somehow he found out. Verse 17, Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, Take this young man to the commander, to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. Now we find here that the nephew risked his life. He literally risked his life by coming to Paul. Had the Sadducees found out that he had gone to Paul and relayed this information, they would have had the nephew put to death. They would have had him killed. They would have, because they had their contacts with the Sicarii, and they would have had the Sicarii put a little knife in him. Now, if the Sicarii themselves had seen him entering or leaving the fortress, they would have assumed that the nephew was a collaborator with Rome, and they would have just done the job without ever contacting the high priest or the Sanhedrin. They would have just done him in, because that's what they were for. The assassins were to put to death all of those who consorted with and collaborated with the Romans. Verse 18. So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you. Then the commander took him by the hand, went aside, and asked him privately, What is it that you have to tell me? And he said, The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. Paul's nephew began by stating that the leaders of the council, the Sadducean leaders of the council, were directly involved in what he was about to relate. But, verse 21, Complete Jewish Bible goes on, don't let yourself be talked into it, because more than 40 men are lying in wait for him. They have taken an oath neither to eat nor to drink until they kill him. And they are ready now, only waiting for you to give your consent to their request. So, verse 22, New King James, so the commander let the young man depart, and commanded him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." The tribune was well aware of how duplicitous Ananias could be. He therefore had no doubt that what Paul's nephew had related to him was the absolute truth. Verse 23, complete Jewish Bible again. Then he, the tribune, summoned two of the captains, or centurions, and said, "Get 200 infantry soldiers ready to leave for Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight, and 70 mounted cavalry, and 200 spearmen," or as the Revised English Bible has, light armed troops. And, going on in verse 24, "Provide mounts to set Paul on, and bring him safely to Felix, the governor," or the procurator. Even though Paul was a Jew, he was still, in the eyes of the tribune, most importantly, a Roman citizen. That took precedence over being a Jew, because Greeks, and this tribune was a Greek. It didn't matter what nationality. If you were a Roman citizen, that came first. Anything else came secondarily. So even though he was a Jew, he was still a Roman citizen. If anything happened to Paul, the tribune would be held accountable. And he knew that. He therefore took immediate action to move Paul out of his jurisdiction to that of the Roman procurator of Judea, who lived in Caesarea. He provided sufficient troops, surely seems that way, 200, and he's got a massive army to protect Paul. Even if the original number of conspirators grew to a larger number, wouldn't matter. There were enough armed Romans to take care of protection. Verse 25, he wrote a letter in the following manner, or to this effect. Now, though it's possible, it's unlikely that either Luke or Paul ever saw the actual letter, hence in the following manner or to this effect, as the translations have. If they didn't see the letter, Luke would only have been able to give the general content of the letter, that is, to this effect, or in the following manner. However, the content of the letter could have been ascertained when its recipient used the letter in questioning Paul, because he would have gone down the letter asking this question and the other, and most of what was in the letter could be ascertained by Paul. And then he could relay that to Luke if Luke wasn't right there. All right, so the letter goes, Claudius Lysias. Now, since Lysias is a Greek name, that was a Greek name, the tribune was, no doubt, a Greek who had been promoted through the ranks of the Roman army. The Roman army was made up of a lot of people other than those from the Italian peninsula. You had those from Spain and different parts of the world who joined the Roman army or who were brought into the Roman army and became loyal soldiers and officers. As we already know from back in chapter 22, at some point during his rise in rank, Lysias had bought his Roman citizenship with a considerable amount of money, which was most likely during the reign of Emperor Claudius, since he took the name Claudius as part of his official Roman name. Claudius Lysias. That was his official name. Generally, there was another name. There's usually 3 names to the official Roman name, but we're not given any more than that. All right, so Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. Antonius Felix was a man who was born a slave. That was his original origin. He was not a Roman citizen. He was not born a Roman citizen. He was born a slave, but he was set free. He was made a free man by Antonia, who was the mother of the Emperor Claudius. So Claudius's mother, apparently the family that served her, had a son, Felix. And so she set him free. She gave him his freedom. He became a Roman citizen. After serving in a governmental position in Syria for 4 years, we find that Felix then was appointed governor or procurator, which is what the Romans called a governor, the procurator of Judea, by Claudius in AD 52. AD 52, where he held rule until being recalled to Rome by Emperor Nero sometime in 58-59 AD. He was an extremely violent man from what historians have recorded. He killed many of those who participated in the increasing number of insurrections throughout Judea during the time that he served there as the procurator. Verse 27, this man, the letter goes on, this man, of course Paul, was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. Now, I think we quickly see here that Lysias rearranged the facts. He did this to protect himself. He claims to have rescued Paul because he had been told that Paul was a Roman citizen. Yet, he did not know the truth of Paul's citizenship until he had given the command to scourge this man, torture this man until he tells us his crime. It was not until then that he found out. So Lysias is he's afraid of Paul because of what he's done and learning about his citizenship after the fact. Verse 28, and when I wanted to know the reason why they were doing this, why they accused him, I brought him before their council. The tribune assured Felix that he had not been swayed by anyone, neither had he jumped to any conclusions, but he had taken the necessary steps to discover the truth of the matter. I rescued him, and then, rather than offend the Jews and cause them to be upset, write letters into Rome complaining about me and you and, other officials of Rome here, I took the steps to find out from them exactly what the problem was. Verse 29, I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains or imprisonment, as other translations have. Lysias reported that the hearing before the Jews' judicial council members confirmed that all of the accusations against Paul were based on the religion of the Jews. That was the basis of every accusation. There was nothing that Paul, a citizen of Rome, had done that warranted imprisonment, much less a death sentence. Nothing. Verse 30, good speed. As I have been informed that a plot against him is brewing, I am sending him on to you at once and directing his accusers to present their charges against him before you. No doubt the tribune waited until after he had found that Paul had been safely delivered to Felix in Caesarea before contacting the Sanhedrin concerning their need to go before the procurator if they desired to pursue their charges against Paul. Lysias also made it clear to Felix that Paul was now in Felix's jurisdiction, not his. I am no more responsible for anything to do with this man. It's all in your hands now. So Felix or Lysias is, he is so glad because Paul's not made any uproar, accused him of anything, and so now it's going to be Felix that catches anything. Verse 31, Goodspeed continues. Then the soldiers took Paul, as they had been ordered to do, and escorted him as far as Antipatris that night. Antipatris was a town located about 30 to 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It was built by Herod the Great and named after his father Antipater. There were several Antipaters, but Antipatris was named after Herod's father. Since the town was also the home of a Roman colony, it was a safe place for the soldiers to stop and spend the remainder of the night. So they stopped there after, again, remember, we had a couple hundred foot soldiers The cavalry, well, it wouldn't be too bad of a trip because they're on horseback, but the other guys, after marching 30 miles from 9 o'clock, and how fast did they march? Of course, they are going downhill for the most part, but nonetheless, it would have been early, probably 2 o'clock in the morning before they had arrived at Antipatris. Since, okay, let's see. Escorting him, where are we? Verse 32. The next day, they left the horsemen, or cavalry, as some of the other translations have. They left the cavalry to go on with him and returned to the barracks. So all of the infantry returned to Jerusalem. All the foot soldiers went back to Jerusalem, leaving the cavalry to take Paul the final 40 or so miles to Caesarea. And of course, they could do that at a much faster pace. They didn't have to wait for the guys on foot. They took off with horses, and they could have gotten to Caesarea easily in a couple of hours. Verse 33, when they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. Now, it was probably a centurion who had the duty of presenting Paul to the governor, to the procurator, as well as the letter. Verse 34, and when the governor had read it, he asked what province Paul, was from. Felix, like all Roman procurators, could only use his judicial authority without contacting Rome if the individual charged with the crime were from a Roman province. If they were from outside a Roman province, he would have to first contact Rome to see if that individual had to be transferred back to a certain colony or whatever. So, okay, I got to find out. Verse 34 goes on, and when Felix understood that Paul was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. Now, Cilicia, as we've covered before, was an important Roman province in Southeast Asia Minor. So Felix found that he did have authority to proceed without contacting Rome. This is something that we can get right to this, in other words. Verse 35 goes on, and Felix, commanded him, Paul, to be kept in Herod's praetorium, or Herod's palace, as other translations bring out. So Paul was placed under military guard in a much better accommodations than the army barracks back in Jerusalem. Herod's palace had flushable toilets and marble and, probably a nice bed. I mean, it was a huge thing, but he's under basically house arrest there. He's under Roman guard. So God's taking care of Paul until he can get to Rome. Verse 1, chapter 24, verse 1. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some of the elders and an attorney named Tertullus, and they presented their case against Paul before the governor. After receiving notice that if he wanted to pursue charges against Paul, he would be required to go before the procurator of Judea in Caesarea, it took Ananias a few days, as we see here, to prepare for going before the procurator and to travel there. He brought a lawyer who was probably Jewish but highly skilled in Roman law. Verse 2, going on in good speed. When Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began the prosecution. Your Excellency Felix, he said, since through your efforts or your rule, we, the Jewish people, enjoy perfect peace or much peace, other translations have, and through your foresight, this nation is securing needed reforms or needed improvements, the Revised English Bible has. Do lawyers ever change? That's the question that we must ask. Aware of the governor's incredible ego, the lawyer, in attempting to sway Felix to think more highly of him, went overboard with flattery. Now, in truth, Felix was not excellency. He was not excellent. In fact, he was despicable. That's the truth regarding Felix. And through your rule, we enjoy perfect or much peace. Well, That was elusive during his time in office. Insurrections were widespread during the time of Felix's governorship there. And then his foresight, through your foresight, this nation is securing needed improvements. The only foresight that Felix had was on what he could get for himself, what he could wheedle out of the people. It was not the good of the Jewish people that his foresight was aimed at, not at all. Going on in verse 3 in good speed, we always and everywhere, that is, we, the Jewish people here in Judea, we always and everywhere throughout the land here acknowledge this with profound gratitude. Tertullus continued distorting the truth in his flattery of Felix. The Jewish people, in actuality, hated, absolutely detested Felix. They hated him so much that they continued, according to historians, they continued complaining to Rome about Felix even after he had been replaced with another procurator. For several years, Rome was still getting letters. How could you send such a despicable person here? Felix was largely responsible for helping to push things to the point of the rebellion and then the Romans coming in and crushing Jerusalem, less than 10 years later, or about 10 years later. Verse 4, Revised English Bible, Tertullus goes on. And now, not to take up too much of your time, I crave your indulgence for a brief statement of our case. We have found this man to be a pest or a pestilence, a fomenter of discord, or an agitator, the New Revised Standard has, among the Jews all over the world. Now, the term the world here means throughout the Roman Empire, because that was the world, the Roman Empire. So throughout the Roman Empire, he's an agitator among all the Jews, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, it's clear, very clear, that the intention of Tertullus was to give the impression that Paul was inciting sedition against Rome. According to him, Paul had agitated Jews in many parts of the Roman Empire by his teaching. In fact, Tertullus claimed here, as verse 5 shows, that Paul taught as one of the leaders of the group, those Nazarenes, the group that followed the man from Nazareth. And that man, Tertullus is implying, was crucified after being charged with sedition by the leaders of the Jews. And here we have the leaders of the Jews here with me today. I'm representing them, and we have the same situation here that existed over a quarter century earlier. Verse 6, Tertullus goes on, he even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him. Now, this was a blatant lie. It was due to false accusations by the Jews from Ephesus that Paul was seized when he came into the temple complex to present himself to a priest in fulfillment of the rites for purification. We saw that back in chapter 21. Paul was there. He had 7 days. This was probably about the 5th day when he was in there when this all blew up. But the lawyer lied. And we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander, Lysias, came by and with great violence took him out of our hands. Now this too was untrue. Lysias took Paul into custody because there was disagreement among the people, those who were a part of the crowd, as to what crime Paul had committed. He asked. He could get no straight answer. One said this, one said the other, because people came because of the commotion. They didn't know what was going on. And so he couldn't get any kind of semblance of a correct answer. Felix, of course, had read the letter from Lysias, which gave the true details. So he knew, other than Lysias finding that Paul was a Roman citizen and went in, but of course even Felix doesn't know that Lysias twisted the facts there. But as far as this part, he read the letter, and Lysias gave the true details. So he knew, Felix knew that Tertullus was twisting the truth. Verse 8. Okay, the commander Lysias came by with great violence, took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. Tertullus completely omitted any mention of the conspirators who had plotted with the Sadducees to assassinate Paul. Well, we understand why he would omit that. However, that information Felix had also learned from the letter that had been sent to him by Lysias, so he was well aware of that. And, verse 9, the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. Ananias and all of the council members that he had brought with him verbally affirmed that everything their deceitful lawyer had presented was the absolute truth. And of course, Felix already knows it's not. So, we're going to stop there because if we get going, we don't have a good place to break. This is the best place to break for quite a while. So, we will pick that up next time.